Almost a year ago now, I put together a comprehensive roundup covering 35 boards based on AMD's B650 chipset, and at the time that was every single B650 board on the market. After months of work, I found that all B650 boards were fit for use with any AM5 processor, having tested them successfully with the Ryzen 9 7950X. And that was a big deal, as it meant you could invest in the AM5 platform with confidence, and that's not something budget builders have been able to do with Intel, as numerous LGA 1700 boards have been found to run excessively hot, often resulting in thermal throttling and therefore a loss of performance. So the fact that you could go with AMD's AM5 platform for your next build and the comfort of knowing that any Ryzen CPU released for the platform will work is kind of nice. Or at least it was while it lasted, because recently I've noticed a few new entry-level B650 boards popping up online from the likes of MSI, Gigabyte and Asrock, and some of them don't look too flash. Now this sort of thing isn't that unusual. Motherboard makers release updated boards or even revisions of existing models all the time. But what is a bit unusual here is that all the new additions are entry-level type models, and they've been released rather quietly. So I went about snapping up these new models for some testing, and some of the results are very disappointing. But what's not disappointing...
Today's video is sponsored by MSI. Thinking of upgrading your monitor? Now is the perfect time, thanks to MSI's stunning new QD OLED gaming monitors. With 4K 240Hz and 1440p 360Hz options, there's something for everyone, whether that's fast-paced competitive gaming on the elite speed of OLED, brilliant HDR gaming on these bright, immersive, well-calibrated displays, or even creator work backed by a 3-year OLED warranty. There's tons of connectivity too, including KVM support. I've been very impressed with the performance of these MSI QD OLEDs, and I strongly recommend them as flagship gaming monitors that will satisfy your needs for years to come. Find out more on MSI's new range of QD OLED gaming monitors via the links in the description.
Okay, we'll start with the new MSI Pro B650M-P, which at present costs just $120 US, and that's much cheaper than their previous entry-level model, the B650M-A Wi-Fi, which cost $160 US back when I made my original roundup a year ago, and funnily enough, it still costs the same amount today. Now, when compared to the more expensive A version, the P looks like a much cheaper model, featuring just a single small VRM heatsink, fewer PCIe 4.0 slots, no Wi-Fi, and fewer USB 3 ports on the I/O panel. Still, it is coming in at a $40 discount, so that all seems reasonable enough. But what about the VRM design? The A version packed 8 55 amp power stages just for the V-core portion of the VRM, and MSI makes note of this on their product page. But for the new P model, they make no mention of the power configuration. And the reason being, of course, is that the VRM on this new model, it stinks. It uses cheap discrete MOSFETs, and they're not doubled up, so it's going to be a very weak board in terms of power delivery. The V-Core VRM features 6 phases using Cinebench SM4337 and SM4503 MOSFETs, and this is a substantially weaker configuration than the A, and I'm not confident it can properly power a Ryzen 9 processor, though the CPU compatibility page over on the MSI website does list support for the 7950X at 170 watts, and of course we'll be testing that claim shortly. Also coming in below the A is the new B650M-B, and while I suspect this model is meant to be cheaper than the P, it's currently only listed at a single retailer over in the US for $135 US, but given the board's specs, that price just can't be right. If I had to guess, I'd say this is a $100 to $110 US product. Now, the B is one of those models that we'd normally just recommend you avoid, as it doesn't include any VRM heatsinks, and unlike a Godlike, for example, this board absolutely needs all the cooling support it can get. And that's because we again have a 6-phase V-Core VRM using discrete MOSFETs, but this time they're even worse alpha and omega parts, 36308 and 36303. You're also only getting a single M.2 port and a single PCIe 3.0x1 slot complementing the standard PCIe 4.0x16 slot. It's a very basic motherboard, which isn't a bad thing, but I suspect the VRM will make it a bad thing. But again, MSI claims on their compatibility page that this model will run the Ryzen 9 7950X, and they claim a wattage of 170 watts. I'm sure they're just listing the official TDP there, but that may prove to be extremely misleading. Now from Asrock, we have the B650M Pro RS, and I thought we'd actually already tested this board as I've looked at the excellent B650 Pro RS, so the ATX version, which packs 14 60-amp power stages just for the V-Core VRM, and it costs $150 US. The Micro ATX version though, which costs slightly less at $135 US, doesn't pack 14 60-amp power stages for the V-Core portion of the VRM. Rather, it has been downgraded to 8 50-amp power stages, which should still work okay, but it is a significant downgrade. Other than that, the boards are fairly similar. The configuration of the I/O panel is very similar. The Micro ATX model drops a PCIe slot, which makes sense. Audio networking is the same. You still get 3 M.2 slots. USB support is also much the same, and you do get a good amount of heatsink coverage on the board. So overall, it is a decent looking board that should work quite well. Then we have the B650M PG Lightning, and I'm not sure how I feel about this one, mostly because I don't yet know the pricing over in the US, but in any case, it's still a bit dodgy. And that's because the ATX model, so the B650 PG Lightning, that packs 14 60-amp power stages for the V-Core, and it works exceptionally well. The Micro ATX version though is armed with just 6 50-amp power stages, and that is a massive downgrade for a board that shares the same name. The ATX version does cost $200 US, and I expect the Micro ATX model to be priced closer to $100, but even so, it's a bit dodgy giving two very different products almost identical names. It's a bit Nvidia-like. And I'm not sure how the B650M PG Lightning will handle the Ryzen 9 7950X. I suspect that will struggle, but should do better than some of the other boards we have in this budget roundup. And of course, we'll look at that shortly. Now, a favourite of mine when it comes to dirt cheap B650 motherboards is Asrock's B650M HDV/M2, which features 8 50-amp power stages of the V-Core, and it costs just $120 US. So when I learned that there was a B650M-H M.2 Plus, I was keen to check it out, especially given it costs just $100 US. This model features the same 650-amp power stage V-Core VRM as the B650M PG Lightning, but with fewer capacitors and cheaper inductors. The heatsink is also bigger on the Lightning and is secured using screws rather than plastic clips. And lastly, also features thermal pads covering the inductors, which will help reduce how much heat is dumped into the PCB, so it's likely performance here will vary between the two models. When compared to the HDV, the H doesn't look nearly as good though. Again, the heatsink on the VRM is much smaller, and the HDV also gets full VRM coverage, along with a heatsink on the M.2 slot. The HDV also comes with a pre-installed I/O shield and receives 2.5 gigabit LAN, whereas the H is limited to gigabit. And you also get 16 USB ports with the HDV, whereas the H is limited to 12, and the second PCIe x 1 slot is full length on the HDV. So for just $20 more, the HDV, in my opinion, is a significantly better product. Now for the Gigabyte boards, and one new model that piqued my interest was the B650M Gaming Wi-Fi, which at present is only being sold at PC Keisky here in Australia, and it's the cheapest B650 board they're selling at just $180 Australian. And that makes it one of the cheapest B650 motherboards you can buy down under. In the US though, well, it is yet to go on sale, so I have no idea what it costs for our American viewers. But based on the pricing here, it should be around $140 US at most, and it's a decent looking board for that price, and it has gaming in the name, so how could you go wrong? But in all seriousness, despite Gigabyte claiming unparalleled performance with a 5+2+2 phases digital VRM solution, it's very trash tier, so you'll just want to avoid it. Spoiler alert, I guess. The V-Core portion of the VRM features just 5 phases using onsemi 4C10N and 4C06N discrete MOSFETs, which isn't going to be enough to power a Ryzen 9 processor or really anything that uses much over 100 watts for sustained load. You're also getting just 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports on the I/O panel, while the other 4 are just the 2.0 spec. There's just a single M.2 port, 2 DIMM slots, and just a single PCIe 3.0x1 slot complementing the standard PCIe 4.0x16 slot. So it is an extremely basic motherboard that in some ways even manages to lack the basics, like storage expansion for example. And another new Gigabyte B650 board is the B650M C V2. And I'm not entirely sure who this model's designed for, but I'm sure someone in the comments will know and let me know if you do. Anyway, it's an unusual looking board that drops the standard 2.5 gigabit LAN found on basically every other B650 motherboard for the old school gigabit LAN. You also get slow Wi-Fi 802.11ac, supporting transfer speeds of up to 433 megabits per second. But quite interestingly, there are 4 PCIe x16 slots in total, though only the primary slot connected to the CPU is wired for x16 bandwidth using the 4.0 spec. The other 3 x16 length slots are only wired for x1 bandwidth using the PCIe 3.0 spec. Then for storage, there's a pair of M.2 slots. One supports PCIe 4.0x4, while the other is a PCIe 3.0x2. Then there is a third M.2, but it's vertically mounted for some reason and only supports PCIe 3.0x1, so it's going to be of very limited usefulness. The I/O also kind of sucks. It's mostly loaded with USB 2.0 ports. There are half a dozen in total, with just a single USB Type-C 3.2 Gen 1 port and 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-A ports. When compared to the B650M gaming Wi-Fi, you're again getting a 5-phase V-core, but this time with doubled up onsemi 4C06N low-side MOSFETs, though you do get just a single high-side 4C10N MOSFET per phase. So a better VRM here, but it's still not great and you only get a very small heatsink. Yet another cheap Gigabyte B650 board is the B650M K, and this one's been on the market for some time now and can currently be had for just $125 US. At first glance, this one looks a lot better than the 2 models that we've already looked at. Gigabyte claims an 8-phase V-core VRM, there's 4 DIMM slots, just 2 M.2s and a single PCIe x1 slot, complementing the standard PCIe 4.0x16 slot connected to the CPU. The I/O panel features just 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports with 2 3.2 Gen 2 ports, one of which is a Type-C. You do get 2.5 gigabit LAN, but there's no Wi-Fi option. As for the V-Core VRM, it's a 4-phase using doublers with onsemi 4C06N on the low side and 4C01N MOSFETs on the high side, so 3 more MOSFET pairings than the B650M gaming Wi-Fi. If the K does indeed end up being cheaper than the B650M gaming Wi-Fi, then I'm not entirely sure why Gigabyte released that board, well, other than money, making it a rather obvious cash grab. Then finally, we have the B650M D3HP, which appears mighty similar to the B650M K, and the price is also very similar at $120 US. When compared to the K, the Q flash button on the I/O panel has been removed, and there's no USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports either, just 4 3.2 Gen 1 ports. There are still 2 M.2 slots, but the secondary slot connects to the chipset, but it still supports PCIe 4.0x4. The VRM has also been downgraded to 5 phases for the V-Core, and this is the same configuration seen on the B650M C V2. So that means we have doubled up onsemi 4C06N low-side MOSFETs, with a single high-side 4C10N per phase. It's not a great looking board, and for $120 US I suspect there will be better B650 options, so let's get into the test results. For testing, I'm using the Height Y70 Touch Tempered Glass Mid-Tower case, and for cooling the Arctic Liquid Freezer 3 360mm ARGB AIO. Then for recording temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, and I'll be reporting the peak PCB temperature. Finally, I'm not reporting delta T over ambient, instead I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, and to ensure a constant ambient temperature, a thermocouple is positioned next to the test system. As for stress testing, I will be using the Ryzen 9 7950X, and for placing load on the CPU, I will be using Cinebench 2024, which was looped for an hour, at which point I'm reporting the maximum PCB temperature, again recorded using K-type thermocouples. Now please note these results won't be comparable to past B650 results for multiple reasons, one being that we're using the latest AGESA code, so a completely different BIOS revision. There's also new hardware, such as the case and cooling, and updated software for generating the load. So let's get into the results. I've added in a few reference points, and one is the Gigabyte B650 RS Elite AX. It's a $200 board that performs very well, as a $200 board should. We also have the Gigabyte B650M DS3H and the MSI B650M-A Wi-Fi, as they were amongst the best value entry-level boards from our previous testing, and today they cost $150. Then of course we have the Asrock B650M HDV/M2, which still costs $120 and is the best value entry-level board in our opinion. As you can see here, the B650M HDV/M2 peaked at 84 degrees and passed our stress test with flying colours, keeping the 7950X clocked at over 5.1 GHz for a 200 watt load and scoring a neat 2,104 points after a 10-minute loop test. So consider this to be the benchmark for budget B650 boards. And that being the case, the new MSI models failed miserably. The B650M-B is limited to a package power of just 90 watts, while the B650M-P, it's not much better at 135 watts. Even with a heap of voltage sucked out of the 7950X, these boards still ran at over 90 degrees, and with strict power limits heavily throttled the Ryzen 9 part. The B650M-B saw an average clock frequency of just 3,980 MHz for a score of just 1,718 points, while the higher power limit of the B650M-P allowed for an average clock frequency of 4,620 MHz, boosting the score to 1,918 points. This means a part like the 7950X will run over 20% faster on a board such as the B650M HDV when compared to the B650M-B, and 10% faster than the -P. So that means these new MSI boards suck, given they cost the same amount or even more than the HDV. Now, the Asrock B650M PG Lightning has a 165 watt power limit in place, but with some decent voltage tuning, it still produced reasonable results despite running at 95 degrees. So I've given it a pass here, I guess, though you could technically fail it given the operating frequency was reduced to 5,050 MHz, about a 2% reduction when compared to the unrestricted boards. So it's certainly not a good product, and again, I'm not a fan of this model sharing its name with the significantly better ATX version, which ran without power limits and saw a peak VRM temperature of 71 degrees. Next, we have the Gigabyte B650M Gaming Wi-Fi, and like the new budget MSI boards, this one is truly awful. After an hour of load running the 7950X, it throttled down to 100 watts, where it produced a score of just 1,384 points, thanks to an average clock frequency of just 3,415 MHz. And to put that into perspective, if you purchased the B650M DS3H rather than the gaming Wi-Fi, you'd be looking at almost 60% greater all-core performance with the 16-core Ryzen processor. Meanwhile, the B650M D3HP wasn't much better, averaging 146 watts for a frequency of 3,570 MHz, and that resulted in a score of just 1,411 points. Then we see that the newest budget board from Asrock also sucked, the B650M-H/M.2 Plus. It features a 165 watt power limit, but that turned out to be a non-issue given the board could only average 122 watts during our test, resulting in an average frequency of just 3,050 MHz and a score of 1,473 points. Now that score is higher than the D3HP, despite a much lower average clock frequency, and this is because these boards handle throttling differently, so the results won't scale in a linear fashion and instead tend to end up a bit all over the place. It really depends on how broken the board is under these conditions and how it handles being broken. Some gently ease the frequency down, while others bounce between the maximum possible frequency they can handle at any given time, and then throttle down as low as 544 MHz for a quick break. The Asus Prime B650-Plus failed our test previously, running at over 100 degrees, and this update saw the board hit 112 degrees, resulting in some throttling for an average frequency of 4,840 MHz and a score of 1,849 points. So not good, but much better than most of the budget boards we've seen so far. Still, Asus has done very poorly here with their B650 range, so much so that you have to spend $190 to get a board that works well, and I guess isn't trash. And that means their first good board would be the Tough Gaming B650-E Wi-Fi. Another budget option from Gigabyte is the B650M K, and like most of the budget Gigabyte B650 boards, it stinks. After an hour of load, we saw an average clock speed of just 4,320 MHz and a package power of 186 watts, resulting in a score of just 1,709 points. They also have the B650M C V2, which is the worst B650 board we've come across yet, and this model averaged just shy of 3 GHz for a pathetic score of 1,120 points. So this is a Ryzen 5 board if I've ever seen one, but of course you should just avoid it entirely. Here's a look at the 10-minute load results, which were featured on the previous graph in text form, but here we're taking a look at the numbers in bar graph form, and you can see just how much slower the boards that failed our test are. Again, the Asrock B650M-PG Lightning is right on the edge of failure, and the performance from the B650M Pro RS wasn't great either, as the board couldn't sustain 200 watts, but at least we saw sub 90 degree temperatures. The B650M-HDV/M.2 is impressive for a $120 board, coming in just 5% slower than the best results you're going to see for this processor, which again isn't bad for a 10-minute stress test. Gigabyte's B650M DS3H, which has been a favourite of ours for some time now, was again excellent, delivering flagship-like performance for just $150 US. Sadly though, most of these new budget B650 boards are really bad and should be avoided, as there are significantly better options available for similar money. Just on a final note, this is why you want to avoid short tests when evaluating motherboard performance. A single pass from idle temperatures saw most of these bad boards produce significantly better scores. The Gigabyte B650M K, for example, it's 28% faster here, as the board never got hot enough from a single pass to throttle the CPU. That said, boards such as the Gigabyte B650M C V2, Asrock B650M-H/M.2 Plus, and MSI Pro B650M-B are all so bad that we were even seeing significant performance degradation from a single pass. Well, that was a disappointing update to our AMD B650 testing. In fact, it's downright horrible. Previously, out of the over 30 B650 motherboards I tested, I found that there were just a few Asus boards that you should probably avoid, the Prime B650 Plus being one of them. And that made the B650 range very consumer friendly, as most models were excellent, ensuring that if you were to upgrade to a more powerful AM5 processor in the future, you could do so knowing you had ample power delivery. But that's all changed now, as these more recently released models are largely trash. I really had high hopes for these boards as well. After all, a year ago, the Asrock B650M HDV proved to be an excellent addition, delivering decent performance for just $120 US. Yet, out of these 9 new models, just 2 of them weren't hot garbage. And even those models, which include the Asrock B650M PG Lightning and B650M Pro RS, they weren't exactly amazing. Well, to be fair, the B650M Pro RS is decent, especially given the $135 US asking price. It is cheaper than the DS3H while offering similar VRM thermals and performance. The B650M PG Lightning, on the other hand, it sucked with its 155 watt power limit and extremely high operating temperatures. Again, I also hate how it shares the same name with the ATX model, which is a significantly better product. And although the M-ATX version is much cheaper, it's still confusing and somewhat anti-consumer. As for the rest of the boards though, there isn't too much more that needs to be said. They're all bad. the Gigabyte B650M-D3HP, as an example, costs just $80, then I might go a bit easier on it, but sadly none of these boards appear to be particularly cheap. They cost as much or more than the Asrock B650M-HDV, and they're all significantly worse, so they simply need not exist. Now you might be thinking, those boards would work well with a Ryzen 5 or maybe even a Ryzen 7 part, and that's probably true. But one of the big draw cards of the AM5 platform is its upgradability, and while you might buy a Ryzen 7 7700 now, and it might work on these boards quite well, there's a reasonable chance you could end up with a future generation Ryzen 9 processor. So having the ability to upgrade to any AM5 processor in the future is obviously a good thing, and especially if you don't have to pay a big premium to do so. And as I just pointed out, there are already affordable boards such as the B650M HDV, the DS3H, or the B650M-A Wi-Fi from MSI that can handle a Ryzen 9 processor, so obviously just buy one of those. And as a side note, I really don't like how board makers can get away with claiming CPU compatibility with CPUs that the board doesn't properly support. Yes, you can argue that technically the 7950X works on these boards, but you're setting a pretty low bar on that one, and it's far from consumer-friendly behavior. Worse still, not only is Asus, MSI, Gigabyte, and Asrock are all claiming Ryzen 9 support on these boards that failed our testing, but they even go as far as to market the power delivery of these boards as something impressive. MSI, for example, in their product page for the B650M-P, under the Power Solutions section, claim Core Boost technology combines MSI's premium layout and optimized power design, which allows for faster and undistorted current delivery to the CPU at pinpoint precision, not only supporting multi-core CPU, also creating perfect conditions for your CPU overclocking. Oh really, MSI? You can overclock on the B650M-P under perfect conditions, no less. What a load of rubbish. But it's not just MSI. At the very top of the B650M gaming Wi-Fi product page, Gigabyte states that the board packs unparalleled performance through its 5+2+2 phases digital VRM solution. They then go on to elaborate by saying their VRM is, and I quote, designed to support AMD's new generation CPUs by offering incredible precision in delivering power to the motherboard's most power-hungry and energy-sensitive components, as well as delivering enhanced system performance and ultimate hardware scalability. So a lot of fairly typical marketing BS there, but at least they're not claiming perfect conditions for CPU overclocking, I guess. The Asrock B650M-H/M.2 Plus product page starts by explaining the board features an optimized VRM design. Not sure what they mean by that, other than it's optimized to save Asrock as much money as possible. They also claim it's optimized for the AMD Ryzen 7000X 3D series processors, so I assume that means the 7950X 3D. And finally, Asus. They claim on their product page that the Prime B650 Plus, and I quote, stable power is essential to extract every last bit of performance out of AMD processors. The Prime B650 Plus is geared to cater to the demands of these high core count CPUs. I guess someone forgot to tell the marketing department at Asus that the Prime B650 Plus can't actually get the last bit of performance out of all AMD processors. Whoopsie. Anyway, I feel like I'm wasting my breath at this point. This has been a major issue for Intel motherboards for years now. I've called it out in at least a dozen videos, but nothing seems to change. And I suppose without consumer pushback, board makers will continue to keep quietly releasing boards like what we've seen here, claiming stuff that the boards simply can't do with compatibility for stuff like 170 watt chips that they don't fully support. At least in this example though, you now know which B650 boards that you should buy and which ones should be avoided. And with that, I'm going to end this video. If you enjoyed this updated B650 testing, then please do give it a like. It was a heap of work and we've invested a lot of time testing B650 motherboards to date. But because these boards should support multiple future generations of CPUs, getting a good one now could prove to be very beneficial down the track. Anyway, like, subscribe, do that stuff. We have Floatplane, Patreon. Signing up to those gives you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&As, and behind-the-scenes content. But other than that, I'm your host, Steve. Thanks for watching.